I became involved with the Beatles actually as early as 1962. I was brought into the picture by Brian Epstein, who knew me as a journalist actually, and offered me the job as the Beatles PR. I had a grand title of Senior Press and Public Relations Officer for NEMS Enterprises, which was his management company, which managed the Beatles and a number of other artists. So I came into the picture full-time basis, actually before Beatlemania broke out at all. Beatlemania does have a birthday. It was in the autumn of 1963 that things really began to happen. And for the first few months, I had been spending all my time going out promotionally, shall we say, looking for media coverage on the Beatles and getting a pretty hard time from the national newspapers generally, getting a better time from the teeny bop magazines who recognised the sort of visual potential of these four nice faces and these four mop tops, that they were good for front covers and so forth. And then in the early part of 1964, the Beatles made their first movie, A Hard Day's Night, and I would go down to some of the locations. I went down particularly to the Scala Theatre, which in fact was precisely where we're sitting now. It's long gone. The Scala Theatre burnt down in 1970 and afterwards, curiously enough, became a television company headquarters for Channel 4 television. And I say curiously because, of course, in the movie, in A Hard Day's Night, the Scala Theatre, this very small West End theatre seating about 350 people, was intended to depict a television theatre where they were supposedly making a television programme. The 350 people who made up the capacity audience, as it was, in the Scala Theatre right at this location, they were by and large actors from drama schools, and they were paid there, $5 or some stupidly small amount to come along here and act. And what they were supposed to be doing was acting as fans. Well, most of them didn't need to be told to act like fans. Most of them were Beatles fans. And they came and saw this one concert. But in fact, in doing so, they got more than most fans who went to one single concert at a theatre, because they saw this done over and over again, which the average theatre goer, the average concert goer, would never see. They were referred to as John, Paul, George and Ringo, and we saw the word Beatles on the drum kit and everything in these the film, but they were never actually referred to as the Beatles. They weren't the Beatles, they were a fictional group with a script, of course, done by Alan Owen, which brought in a lot of the Liverpool humour, which it should have done, of course. Alan was in a beautiful position to know what Liverpool humour was all about, and he knew how the four boys would be able to kind of translate his lines into very, very natural spoken words.
There you go, hiding behind a smokescreen of bourgeois cliches. I don't go messing about with your earphones, do I? Spoil sport. Well,
the press generally, the media at large, were treating the Beatles as a pop sensation, a teeny bopper sensation, phenomenon, rather than anything else. They weren't all that surprised, they weren't all that impressed to hear that the Beatles were going to make a movie, because all pop stars in those days, in Britain and in America, made movies. Therefore, I think they went with very low expectations, and because the Beatles were by now making #1 records on both sides of the Atlantic, I think the press knew that they would have to say some nice things about the Beatles, because the press always go along with the flow of public opinion in such situations. But they did not realise that they were going to find a movie that actually had a well-written script, an entertaining script, and with songs in it that were not just sort of rubbish, throwaway songs thrown onto the soundtrack, as it were. They were all good songs, which in fact John and Paul had written in a great hurry. And in my experience, John and Paul were often at their best. The Lennon-McCartney-Tunesmith duo was at its dynamic best when it was working under pressure and to a very short deadline. And with this, they really were working to a very short deadline with most of the tunes for the movie, and the title one in particular, because, of course, the title wasn't thought of until the last moment. So all these things actually made it particularly exciting for the press, unexpectedly, shall we say, exciting for the media when they came to actually review the film. And there was a sort of sharp intake of breath, of surprise at seeing these four guys not coming out of it as magnificent, you know, Shakespearean actors or anything like that at all. They didn't have to act. The Beatles were more or less being John, Paul, George and Ringo in the movie.
We can't walk out on us now.
Can't he? He's done it, son.
Hey, you know what happened?
We know.
Your grandfather, he stirred him up.
He hasn't.
Yeah, he filled his head with notions, seemingly.
But at the beginning, when they heard they were going to do a pop movie, they were put off the idea because, again, they were looking at past track records of the movie business and its treatment of pop music, which would be a string of DJs, a string of people performing recordings, and that would be miming to recordings, and that would be it. The Beatles wanted there to be something very different about theirs, and of course humour was the difference, the big difference. And this, I suppose, brought out the humorous aspects of their personalities, and I suppose it just sort of well, it acted as a catalyst, if you like, a two-way catalyst, if you like, between the Alan Owen script and the Beatles' own sense of humour. And it meant that the public had a much faster appreciation, an instant appreciation of that other side of their talents, the humorous side of it. What did come across is the actual group as it was, off as well as on. Alan Owen had captured a lot of what the Beatles were like when they were off camera, off stage, etc. And I mean, a lot of the one-liners that the Beatles came out with in that film were, in fact, things that they had said to each other and to us long beforehand in the office. I mean, the typical one-liner might be me saying to George, "Oh, you've had your hair cut," and he would say, "Yes, that one." That kind of thing. The Beatles were coming out with that kind of stuff all the way along the line to their inner circle of business associates or buddies, pals and mates, so that we were all used to that kind of thing. But their humour had not been exposed before in public to the same extent. And therefore there was this magnificent marriage of Liverpudlian scriptwriter Alan Owen, who had a good sense of humour himself, marriage between that and the Beatles, who had the same Liverpudlian natural sense of humour. The marriage of these two things worked beautifully. And a lot of the humour in the film was pure Beatles and pure Liverpudlian. And there was this blurring between fact and fantasy in that a lot of the things that were said, we don't know to this day with some of those sort of one-liners, catchphrases, call them what you will, whether they came originally from a Beatle or whether they actually came from Alan Owen's inventive brain.
You'll really dig them, their fab and all the other pimply hyperboles.
I wouldn't be seen dead in them. The dead grotty.
Grotty went down after the film as being sheer Beatles. A Beatlesque word would be grotty. In fact, the Beatles never used the word grotty in real life at all. They tended to do so after the movie because they realised that they were supposed to now. And other things like that, looming large in your legend, the phrases like this that the Beatles used afterwards. And one thing, for instance, there was one line that Ringo used, a question and answer that came from the press conference scene in the movie.